Alignment and impact. Alignment and impact. Alignment and impact. Those were two words that started GE Aviation on a journey towards better aligning the strategic workforce planning function with the overarching business. And what do I mean by that exactly? Well, I was having a conversation when I first arrived and beginning the role with the CFO and our vice president of HR, and they had started down the road and doing some strategic workforce planning, and it had some small wins, but it had a lot of areas that needed development. And the CFO really, and quite simply said to me, can we get something that is aligned with the business and that demonstrates an impact on the business? That's all I want. And that's what he said. And I had to think about it a little bit. I had come from sort of a old school, let's just do some attrition modeling, plug in the finance headcount numbers, and talk about a gap, and there you go. Here's a workforce plan for you. Move it, shuffle some people around, and we've done something really special. That wasn't cutting it with the CFO and our HR vice president. So there was a need and a requirement to do something else, something different, something that was fundamentally aligned with the growth of the business in areas and the retraction with the business in areas, and that's what we started to talk about. I basically learned three things since I've been there in this role. The first thing is that there is a bit of a lack of understanding around what strategic workforce planning actually is in the context of analytics, headcount planning, budgeting. The second is that what we had done in the past and what we tend to struggle with is that alignment piece. How do we take our planning and turn it into something that's actionable in the context of what the business is trying to do, not in a silo as a project or an HR project that's not adding value? That's something that we really struggle with at GE Aviation. And the third thing is that they have this strange affinity for chili spaghetti in Cincinnati. I don't understand it. They love this sort of chili spaghetti stuff. I don't know. It's weird. My name is RossSparkman. I am the Strategic Workforce Planning Leader at GE Aviation. Today we are going to talk about a few things that we've been doing at Aviation and the journey that we've been on to better align our people strategy with our overarching corporate strategy. The business asked for workforce planning. We gave it to them, but they still don't take us serious. Why? This was another conversation I had following the conversation I just had with the CFO and the vice president of HR. I was talking to an HRM in our Terre Haute plant who put together a nice little strategic workforce plan. They went and they took a historical attrition analysis. They went and they talked to some business leaders about what they thought the headcount demand was going to be in the future. They plugged those numbers into a nice little model, and then they analyzed the gap. And fast forward a couple years later, their forecasts were completely off. And now this HR manager was coming to me and saying, we sort of did what you told us to do, and now they're laughing at us, right? And I said, okay, well, let's take a step back a little bit and analyze what you actually did. And that's going to sort of be what we're talking about today in the context of driving a workforce plan that's truly aligned with the business, using statistics, using business drivers, using finance in the context of a cost constraint rather than actually using those as headcount numbers to forecast. Before we go on, can anybody tell me what the significance of this picture is here in the context of workforce planning? Does anybody have any idea? Nobody?
Different factors have to work together.
Nice, good. I actually totally just put it on there. I forgot to take it off, so I was going to see if there's anybody else can figure it out. You win. You're good. You're good. You get my job. Yeah, totally a random thing, but there you go. That makes sense. So next time I present on this, we can use. I'm going to quote you on that. That was good. I actually literally forgot to delete that thing, but it's cool. I like it. Workforce planning. What is it anyway? Okay, there's another conversation I had from an anonymous business leader, one of our divisions. He quoted this: providing the right people in the right place at the right time for the right cost. I'm sick of hearing that. I hear that all the time. What does it mean? Show me, demonstrate to me, please do something that actually tells me how I can get some type of return on investment with my people. I get that we need the right people in the right place at the right time, but how do we actually do that with workforce planning? It was a great question. And again, that's sort of with the theme of what the CHR, or the vice president of HR and our finance leaders were talking about. They wanted something that was more substantial in terms of output from what we were doing. So in the context of that, I always like to sort of step back, and this is sort of the conversation I have with a lot of people in HR, sometimes even finance leader, operation leaders, and talk about HR in sort of a different light and why we would want to do workforce planning, what we really are trying to do in the context of business. It's going to sound sort of very capitalistic, but fundamentally, what is the point of a business? Irrespective of social responsibility, I mean, I'm with all of that stuff, but fundamentally, why did somebody start a business? Like, if you were to start a Kool-Aid stand, what were you doing that for? I would think probably to make money, right? So, stepping back even further, we would say that, okay, well, who then are the owners of the company for a publicly traded company? It's our shareholders, right? And why did they invest in the company? Because they wanted to make money. So everything that we do then, from a business standpoint, should be to increase the value of their investment, increase shareholder value, right? So when GE Aviation goes and we invest a bunch of money in R&D, we run the analysis. We're looking for positive net present value projects. Just that simple. We're not going to go and invest any type of money in anything that doesn't have a positive net present value, because otherwise we're not going to make any money. We take the money we make from those positive net present value projects and invest them in more positive net present value projects. Okay? That's one way that you can increase shareholder value. The other is through asset efficiency, right? Making sure that you have an optimized process in place to really utilize your assets and to drive company performance to gain the rewards on those net present value projects. Some people would say that human capital is an asset. Maybe it's your most valuable asset on the balance sheet. It's definitely one of your most expensive assets on the balance sheet, arguably. Operating margins. Here, we're really just trying to increase our profit, right? And how do we increase our profit? Technology, improving processes. Well, who improves the processes? It's the people, right? So when I think about driving an improvement in shareholder value, I absolutely think that HR plays a huge part in being able to do that. Now, we play in all three of those spaces. Investor expectations, largely based on how we're doing with our operating margins and our asset efficiency and the types of projects and investments that we're making. I think that what we struggle with as an HR function sometimes is thinking about HR in the context of driving shareholder value. Everything that we should do as an HR function, whether it's building relationships within the company that are a little less tangible and hard to measure, driving engagement across the organization, planning our people, making sure that we have the right people in the right place at the right time, at the right cost, should all be done under the blanket of trying to improve the performance of the company. So we shouldn't be doing anything unless it's trying to improve our performance. That's why we would want to do workforce planning, because that gives us a quantitative platform now to say, if we do this and save this much money in this area, or develop these employees with these skills that are going to increase our operating margins and improve the likelihood of success in the projects we take on, then we're doing our part. And that's why we want to do the planning. So I think that's what's fundamentally, there's some confusion out there when we as HR practitioners start talking to each other, why are we doing this? I don't get why we're doing this. Why would we not be doing this? We have the most valuable asset in the whole company. We should be planning the way finance plans for plant and equipment on the balance sheet, right? These are people. We have the potential to build loyalty, to increase their skills, to increase their efficiency. So I mean, if there's any area where we would want to do and plan, it's in this space. So what's HR's role in creating shareholder value? And that's really what I just talked about. I mean, if you think about developing employees, acquiring and retaining the best employees, and driving engagement and a shared vision, that's all area that we could potentially optimize, or talent management functions that we could potentially optimize that could potentially increase our profit margins, operating efficiency, and overall performance. If we do it properly, though. In order to do that, we have to plan for it. We have to understand from a data perspective what we're dealing with today and then future state, and then be able to take what we learned, pull the necessary levers to optimize that mix of talent that will in turn drive those net present value projects. So let's step back now and talk about a little more what we actually do, or what we started doing at GE Aviation with workforce planning, and then how we've worked towards more aligning that with our overarching strategy. This is probably a typical framework that if you have any experience in workforce planning, you might have seen. I even heard a few people talk about talent segments, supply and demand, et cetera, of course. Defining the talent segments, here what we're doing is really going out and we're segmenting the workforce into different areas and then trying to understand the criticality of those different areas based on set criteria. And then we take those different talent segments and we essentially develop an attrition forecast based on a bunch of different variables. And then we develop a demand forecast. And this demand forecast piece is what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today because, again, it's the part that I've seen where we struggled with. Once we've done that, we will maybe see a gap, maybe we won't see a gap. It could be a surplus. It could be a shortage. But whatever that gap is, now we need to act on it. And the actions that we take based on that analysis are what in theory should be driving that shareholder value that we talked about. It's where we get to put on our strategy hats. Whether you want to take a spot, whether it's a table or wherever you want to, whenever you're sitting down with the senior business leaders, this is the opportunity to make an impact. But it has to be made on the basis of solid analysis based off of numbers that are aligned with numbers that the company is forecasting. And then you take action. That's really what the change management piece comes into play, where our ability as leaders and our ability to understand the business comes into play, because that's where we have the opportunity to actually take what we've learned and make a difference. So this is what we're kind of doing at GE Aviation. Where we started to struggle, or where I saw the areas where we struggled and what we're driving some of those questions around what is workforce planning, impact, alignment, why don't we have it? You know, we're giving them what they want, but they don't like it. Why not? What I've seen at aviation when we started was these two areas right here specifically were what was sort of our Achilles heel. Talent segmentation and then demand forecasting. We didn't do this well. We sort of knew what they were, but we didn't really know how to develop a robust process for actually developing something actionable. So I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on what I'm talking about here and what we do with these, and how we define them at aviation. I use aviation whenever I talk about GE because we have so many businesses, by the way. So I feel like you guys are fairly well versed on what talent segmentation is. I hope you guys are. We struggle with this a little bit, a lot actually. And what we thought that talent segmentation was really just going and taking a bunch of different job types, grouping them together in key areas, and then analyzing each of those and taking action on each of those talent segments equally. But yeah, you're like, no, exactly. There's critical talent segments and there's not critical talent segments. I'm not in a critical talent segment. If my job, if I didn't show up for work for the next 2 weeks, for the next 2 years, nobody's going to miss me. I would like to think they were, but I'm not in a critical talent segment. Our manufacturing engineers, if they all didn't show up tomorrow, are going to have a profound impact on the business. I think maybe that's the reason why HR people don't like this, is because HR is definitely not what I would consider a critical. Maybe in some of your organizations it is. In mine, it's not. I hate to say it, but we're not. So think of it as if you were not to show up tomorrow, or if a group of employees were not to show up tomorrow, who is going to shut down the business? And it could be the custodial staff. It doesn't matter what the level is. It's who's going to stop the business from being able to operate. Arguably, some people would say if the CEO didn't show up tomorrow, that the business would go on, right? It's who's going to actually have an impact and stop the business from moving forward if you didn't show up. So if you look at this little grid right here, we have sort of capability and capacity on the Y and the X axis. If you look at segment 2, and that segment represented your manufacturing engineers, and you looked at segment 1 and that represented HR, you might be inclined to think that you would want to deal with segment 1 maybe ahead of segment 2, or probably even. But if segment 2 is really what's driving a good portion of your business in terms of being able to execute your strategy, you probably want to focus on segment 2 then, right? That's the sort of context that we're talking about in terms of being able to look at the criticality of the workforce, sort of put egos aside, and think about, who do we start with in terms of planning. That was an area that we struggled with. This was the area that we really, really, really struggled with, so much that we didn't have any type of acumen or understanding of how to do this. Business drivers, the crux of strategic workforce planning. I feel like it's probably pretty intuitive, but for some reason we just couldn't get our minds wrapped around this. I think it's because maybe we had a really long legacy of doing things a certain way. And really what we did was we took the inputs from finance and we used that as our projections into the future. And then we found ourselves in this reactive mode all the time. Like, why are our projections? We would say our projections. And that was my first thing. Like, wait, didn't finance just give you those numbers? How are we projecting anything? So we would sort of have this discussion around, well, our numbers aren't right. We're not having the right people in the right place. And we're not able to leverage skills across the workforce. We don't know what's happening in Terre Haute versus what's happening in Ellisville, Mississippi. And what became clear to me was that it was a function of not understanding the demand drivers. So hopefully you can see this graph right here. What we then did was we took a statistical approach to doing the forecasting. So we would go and we had a bunch of discussions with a lot of different business leaders, basically pulled out 100 different data points that either came directly off the balance sheet or income statement or directly from the operations. And then we regressed the headcount, the historical headcount against those business drivers, developed correlations, really statistically significant correlations, and then created a regression function that we could then plug in our business driver forecasts that the business was giving us. So in our case, we'd go back and we'd look at headcount against engine production as a really high-level example. And we'd see that there was a really strong correlation, not surprising. The more engines we produced, the more people that we needed. We were then able to say, based off of the function that we built, if we're going to go from 20 engines in 2014 to 50 engines in 2017, how many more people will we need? So now we can quantifiably say, okay, this is no longer just, I think that we need 14 people. No, this is specifically based on the direction of the business. And now the onus doesn't become your HR's forecasts are wrong. We're using the business's forecasts. We're using our own growth plans to forecast what our people requirements should look like. And that can trickle down all the way down to skills. And we're able to see then the cyclicality of the business. So if we're ramping up in one part of the organization and downscaling in another part of the organization, then maybe we can repurpose these employees in this part of the organization to where we need the demand in another part of the organization. And the way we used to do it would just be, yeah, we're just increasing, so let's hire some more people. Oh, now we're decreasing, I guess I have to let those people go. There was no visibility or alignment across all the different divisions. So when you start to be able to do that, now you're, again, starting to see real cost savings, the ability to really drive efficiency, because now you're having people that have the proper skills, to the whole people, right place in the right place at the right time. So that's really the crux of what demand forecasting is. You can go and you can run a 20, like I said, we literally took 100 different variables and put it into a regression model. But what we found was that, to be perfectly honest, most of those variables correlated with each other. And so you want to keep sort of a parsimonious model, and it ended up being to where you only need one or two key business drivers, depending upon the part of the business that you're looking at. Arguably, you could say that global air traffic demand is probably the best business driver. More air traffic, more airplanes, more engines. It's a trickle down. It's a lagging indicator, but I always tell them that it's always going to be a good correlation with that. And some people want to listen, some people don't. But okay, so let's talk now about where we've in the past started to see more confusion, and why, our CFO and our HR vice president were struggling with this alignment piece. If you see the part of the chart that's blue, with the 433 number, we basically have time on the horizontal axis. And you'll basically just see that's our attrition forecast. So if you were to do absolutely nothing today, you would see that hire nobody through natural attrition and through the attrition modeling that we did, you would lose a certain amount of people that you would have to, in theory, hire through backfills. The red part, the red line, represents the demand that we just talked about. So if you're producing X number of engines today, and in the future that increases by X percentage, that's going to mean X percentage more people. So that's where those numbers are coming from. The confusing part, though, is now the green line, because this is the numbers that finance is giving to HR and is planning for. And I remember one of the struggles I had when I was really getting into this with some of our HR leaders was, these aren't the same numbers that finance is giving us. Why is it so much more, or why is it less? Why isn't it exactly the same? And I said, well, look at what finance is trying to do. Back to that operating margin piece. They're trying to reduce our costs, right? And by doing that, they're not going to give you an unlimited supply of money to buy a workforce. You have to become more efficient. You have to leverage skills across the workforce. You have to understand what regrettable attrition is versus non-regrettable attrition, and leverage those levers to reduce that delta right there. So if you see the 536 and the 503 number, you're not going to get money for 536, but the 536 represents the growth in the business. So if you want to achieve that 7% revenue CAGR, that's what the business is telling you you want to do, but they're not going to give you the money to do it. You have to find another way to achieve that efficiency. You have to find out a way to reduce the delta. And that's when we can really put on our strategy hats and say, okay, well, so we have to make up, this many people. We know we're downsizing another part of the business. Let's move some people over here. We know if we upskill the workforce here, they're going to become more efficient. We don't probably need as many people here. We know that if we can let some of those people that maybe aren't doing as well in the company go, not give them bonuses or whatever, we can reduce that delta through natural attrition. So there's a lot of different ways, and that's when we put our strategy hats on, and we think through this. And this is when HR really now becomes a strategic partner for the business. And these are real dollar terms that we're talking about here. This is a small little talent segment, but scale this to 45,000 employees, scale this to 100,000 employees. Now we're talking tens of, 20s of, 50s of millions of dollars, right? And you're also setting yourself up for future success, because now you're not developing a talent mix today that is just going to be extrapolated in the future. You're taking your talent mix today and optimizing it to drive performance in the future. And that's powerful. That's really powerful. Suddenly, that alignment and impact and hands in the air, what is strategic workforce planning, is sort of goes away. Now I need this individual in the room before we even talk about anything with regards to our operating budget next year. That's alignment. Bringing it all together. The way that we've done it really starts with getting the right people in the room. So if we're looking at a smaller, we usually start smaller. We'd have an employee group of 500 or 600. We get sort of a finance representative, an operations representative, an HR representative, and we'll just talk about what are the critical segments. Let's start there. So we'll take that employee group of 500 and whittle it down to the actual critical talent segment. Then we'll talk about what the business is doing, what are the relevant business drivers that we would want to try to look at and analyze against these employees, agree on those, and definitely agree on them. That's one of the key things here, because if finance has agreed on it, and if operations have agreed on it, when you create the model, they can't give you any pushback because that's their assumptions. It's their data. It's their forecasts. We're just the HR people executing on the HR strategy with their data. Agree on the attrition assumptions. I mean, this is generally a huge deep dive that we'll go and we'll do some type of logistic regression to see, what are the key variables that impact, or what types of variables likely will impact different employee segments. So I don't know that you necessarily have to go that deep. I think, was it Buddy made the comment that you can pretty much say 4 to 5% attrition and be fairly accurate. It's roughly the same at aviation also. Then you go and you develop the demand forecasts. You take those supply and demand forecasts, you bring them back to finance, and you explain the rationale. They say, yep, that sounds about right, and nope, we're not going to give you any more money to get those people. And then you go and you get back together and you start strategizing around ways to reduce the delta and increase efficiency. Now, challenges we face, this sounds really simple to get up here and just say, you just go and you just do this and, it all comes together. It doesn't just all come together. I mean, there's some really contentious discussions. It's a complete paradigm shift between the way that we had always done things, where finance is just, the folks that own everything and they're the kings, to being a discussion around, okay, well, if we're going to reduce our headcount budget by this much, this is what specifically we're going to have to try to make up for in our efficiency. And sometimes you'll have a number like 8%. It's like, just know that if you want to grow at 16% CAGR year over year, and you're cutting us our workforce budget by X percentage, that there is a risk there. Know that. It's a complex methodology. If you really want to get into some really good demand forecasting, it's fairly statistic intensive. That's something to consider. Then there's the piece of, why do I want to go and do this? How does this benefit me? And that's when you articulate, well, this is really your chance to really make an impact on the business. Different languages, different words, different terminologies, using things like demand drivers in itself is not something that, at least in aviation, we were used to, right? So there can be some comfort levels that are tested. And then you take into account that GE Aviation, we're 85 sites globally, really matrixed. Things are a lot different in Malaysia than they are in Czechoslovakia. So you have to talk about the complexities globally, regionally. It's challenging. And then, of course, there's the natural resistance to change. Senior level buy-in. Even though they're the ones that are throwing their hands up talking about alignment, and sometimes they struggle with this too. It's a risk for them. They're out of their comfort zone. It's a new way of thinking. At GE Aviation, we have a very mature workforce that, people have been there 35 years, whose parents have been there 35 years, whose parents have been there 35 years. So that resistance to change is even magnified. Lessons that we learned: start small, really small, demonstrate proof of concept. Celebrate the small wins, and make sure that when you're celebrating those small wins that you have the hand of an HR business partner in your hand, and make it something that they owned and they developed, because when their colleagues see that they've done this with you and they developed this amazing model that's getting a lot of attention, it becomes contagious. Everybody wants to do it. Persistence. At the end of the day, you got to stick with your messaging, find creative ways to get out there and get people to try new things. Networking, having those informal conversations. And then ultimately, even though they may resist change, you got to have that executive support. And for us, it really did start when we were with the CFO and the vice president, and they were alignment, impact. I mean, that's sort of the burning platform right there. And with that, you can take it and run with it. But know that it's going to be challenging, and it's going to be something that takes a lot of people out of their comfort zones, potentially. Unless you guys are all doing it already, and we're just way behind. I don't know. For us, it was. So, questions? Good. Cool. If anybody wants to reach out to me, LinkedIn or anything like that, we can talk offline. Give me your ideas or things that you've faced in terms of challenges or new ways of looking at this. Perfect. Thanks.